Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine auxiliaries between the 4th and the 11th century. I think this is a very important chapter to consider overall, right? So this is obviously going to be in generalistic terms as a video, as you know, this is potentially an infinite topic covering lots of peoples and fighting styles, military cultures and traditions. Yet, I think it's very important to understand the structural impact and functionality attached, of course, of the presence of such forces into the Roman Empire during these centuries. We could talk a lot also just in introductive terms about the importance of these forces in the same Byzantine military thinking at a certain level, given that the Roman Empire in these centuries, as you know, is pretty much troubled, right? There are several setbacks. There are sometimes very traumatic events, such as the Islamic invasions, for which basically one half of the empire is lost. And therefore also the migration era as a whole, that towards the eastern part of Europe and parts also of the same Near East objectively takes longer, right? Because there are more peoples on the move, and these are going to be attracted, right, like with a magnet to Constantinople, right? Because this was objectively a massive state, right, with an imperial dimension, of course, but it was essentially these big structures that all of these peoples that very often were predatory, especially the ones of the steppes, but also the warfare of the time generally entailed these forms of, even of raiding warfare, this idea of, seizing as much as possible in these operations that were so costly, especially in early medieval times, that it was like one shot, like you had to into which you had to bet much of your, like, even in entire generations of efforts, right? We're unavoidably into strict contact with Constantinople that had to deal with these peoples, right, individually. And Byzantine military culture and thinking at this time was very, very malleable, was very, very flexible, let's say better, and capable of understanding the people. At this point, the Byzantine military culture gets the best fundamentally from classical ethnographical interests and strategic thinking, and the Byzantines are very often one step ahead of these populations, not just because of their military organization in strictly military, let's say, in terms of armed forces and their organization, their logistics, but also in the way they looked at these peoples, and they were able to interact with them in a way that, of course, could have a strategic advantage for Constantinople. And this entails a lot of cultural intelligence, right? In knowing what are the strengths and the weaknesses of these peoples, being able to turn them one against the others instead of pouring against the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, like it often happened, where basically all the assaults were crashed and throughout all these centuries, and but also absorbing their military, essentially their fighting styles. And this is also another very important process that is somewhat misunderstood in a certain and overlooked, I would say, in a certain part, because it's obvious that at all times the Byzantine armed forces were fundamentally part of a state, right? They, especially throughout this time, reliance on mercenaries was something, but at the same time was always a permanent army, like a real core statal army that was in part centralized under the direct control of the emperor. Another part was fundamentally a regional, a set of provincial armies fundamentally were gathered according to the theater, where in fact they were sometimes even called, or they were simply fighting because of all the invasions that existed at this point, and therefore there is this schematic division between what was strictly Byzantine and what was foreign, right, in a certain dimension of these allies and auxiliaries and mercenaries, etc. And sometimes the distinction here is very loose, especially when we talk about these lighter troops like light cavalry, light infantry, and especially horse archers, especially towards the end of this period, that you can distinguish, of course, in the sense that, of course, if there was thousands of pecheneks, as we will see, that poured into the Byzantine army because they were paid for them as mercenaries, those are pecheneks. But what happens in parallel within the Byzantine army is that the Byzantines are able to basically assimilate those fighting styles that were evidently not proper of a sedentary civilization like the Byzantines were at this point, but that that were able to replicate basically exactly in the same way. So this is actually a process that now we made the example of the pecheneks because we will see how important and radically important the will be, especially towards the 10th, the 11th century for Byzantine forces. But this is something that had already been started since the migration era, since the 4th, 5th, especially the 6th century, when you can see that Byzantine forces are at this point really a melange, right, of different peoples coming from everywhere, and still there is this ability of the army to frame these foreign elements within their ranks, but also to copy them, to copy their training, their equipment. And in fact, throughout all this period, Byzantine forces have really even a technological edge. Sometimes they're ahead, basically, of most peoples, or at least they are the military power at this point that have the larger amount of know-how and technical capabilities than others. And if you follow Schwerpunkt regularly, you know how I warn from absolute not reading military history through technology, because that's probably the worst mistake you can ever do in any military context whatsoever. But because this is really literally the ABC of military history. Literally, if you interpret military history through technology like the leading factor, you basically know literally nothing about warfare. But the point here is also realizing the importance of technology for the one it really has, and observing how the Byzantines were able at this point to not just to absorb, which is already a big deal, but to make work, and sometimes even to make an original synthesis, right? This is not cultural appropriation. There's not a single people in the history of mankind that didn't work through what we call like cultural appropriation, right? Every single people in the world has learned from someone else, and even his original achievements are on the base of the shoulders of other peoples that came before them in a massive way. And progress happens always little step by little step, right? So there is nothing like that. But there is, measuring these things is important, because it shows you how a people is if you acquaint a people with a certain technology or know-how, that is not sufficient by itself to make that people understand it, right? Because if that people has not the fertile ground for acquiring that technology, then maybe it's even useless for it, because the ratio cost benefits doesn't fit it, and that's the reason why most technologies cannot be applied, historically speaking. It has nothing to do with the backwardness of a technical backwardness. It's literally that there is no need to employ it, right? But also, when instead you find someone that is able to learn and to reapply, and sometimes even in a better form, you know already that people is already at the same level, if not beyond, in terms of technological advancement. And Constantinople at this point is on the lead. The Roman Empire is this harbor of thoughts and ideas. We don't have to think like the empire as a closed gate where nobody was. This was still a very extremely permeable world. The borders here basically didn't exist as such. And much of the military resources of the empire were drawn from populations that even settled within their borders. I mean, think about the Slavs that poured massively into Byzantine. Well, those were surely absorbed in large part, especially in certain regions towards the south, and became Romans on their own, and all this contributes not just to the military, contributes to the agriculture, economy, and everything. So, okay, doing things in order. There are so many sources. Probably looking at the allies and also neighbors of the Byzantine Empire from a military point of view. The most important one is likely the strategicon of the Pseudo-Mauritius, fundamentally, that shows you this wide variety of populations that are described with an incredible accuracy. I can't say it's an overlooked source, but when you read it, you know maybe a bit already the history of those peoples on your own. You're able to see really how intelligent that Byzantine look this population was, and how intelligent was also the response to those strengths that were highlighted, and also the weaknesses, of course. And naturally, I don't want to say either that the Byzantines weren't somewhat distrustful towards their neighbors. Everybody is in some measure, like historically speaking, especially when warfare is basically endemic at all times. And even your own allies can potentially turn against you at every moment, because simply of any political upheaval can happen within or outside of their political affairs. So naturally, there are many warnings. There is a bit of a slight xenophobia towards that is rooted not just into Byzantine society, but also in Hellenic thinking since a long time. So here, there is a different approach, slightly different approach from what the Roman one had been, the Latin, Italic one had been in the past. But yet it's very sophisticated. Like, the Hellenic element adds a lot of intellectual, really development to the story that at a certain point it backfires, because the intellectual superiority has probably it's a great thing, but it has probably no worse enemy than itself, meaning that you can narcissistically fall in love with yourself, which is in part, even though it's controversial kind of as an interpretation, to what would happen to the Roman Empire in later times, especially during the lower Middle Ages, where this kind of conservative thinking of what the essentials of Byzantine, of Roman culture was at the time, didn't probably allow, because of cultural resistance, not of the system as a whole, but chiefly of its oligarchies towards something else that was happening around, especially in the West, because let's be frank about this, that in lower medieval times the major threat to the empire would come to the West, not from the East. At this time it would mostly come from the East instead. But there are these attitudes, like, the same strategicon says, that warns commanders that allies should be kept, for example, in the dark about the Byzantine plans, and thus they may desert to the enemy. Well, yeah, this is kind of a reasonable advice, but this already tells us not much about the absolute validity of this, which is obviously relative. But it tells us, in fact, the relative context. It was a point in which sometimes the Byzantines were hiring entire contingent, like massive contingents. I'm talking even about in range of thousands, even more, of completely foreign peoples, that some of which had some part of them might have been Romanized throughout their own history, as some could come from Central Asia at that point, and just acquainting Constantinople, and and being a completely different mindset, right? But deserters are present everywhere. Like, it was obviously full, of Byzantine deserters that could desert to the enemy. But evidently here, the meaning of the strategicon is mostly, be aware of the fact that we have so many of these foreigners in our right? And they're chiefly auxiliaries, right? These are not Byzantine. This is not the Roman army proper. These are not Byzantine units recruited from within the same frontiers. These are external. They are aliens, right? Obviously, as we were saying before, looking at the various peoples, this ethnica, like they were known in Greek, is looking at their different military cultures, their techniques, their amenability to discipline, which was particularly important in order to frame them, to discipline them, to train them, to turn them to soldiers, right? Because this sometimes was also done. It's not that these troops were recruited just for the sake, like, merely like throwaway troops that eventually you would discharge at the end of the campaign. It could happen, but some of them were even difficult to dislodge, or maybe could be conveniently settleable, let's say, within the empire, because they counterbound certain internal political changes. So the Byzantines care about the level of the general level of civilization of a people, and this appears from military treatises throughout all Byzantine history that fortunately produced these sources and that are extremely valuable piece of information, right? And so talking about the various peoples, we could talk a bit before, like in the earlier times, and then switching to like towards the 11th century, the 10th, 11th century. There are substantial changes. So we can start with the Serbs, as basically the most numerous of the peoples who invaded Byzantine Balkan provinces were the Slavs. So the Slavic migrations, we discussed them on Schwerpunkt. I even dedicated a playlist to medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe. We have seen how the Slavs expand at the end of the migration era, like a sort of human tide, right? They're not initially like entire like confederations like the Germanic ones had been. There's sometimes not even properly clear tribal entities. There are sometimes even just clans that expand very autonomously, but in a very capillary way, so that basically you can't stop them, because these are just like migrants arrive from everywhere. They're difficult to control. I think like what was happening here in the 6th and 7th century, what it meant to control a frontier, right? And especially in this time, telling the truth, human resources demographic resources were quite important. The Romans had stopped basically massacring peoples as long as they understood that settling them in the empire could fill the gaps of the now sometimes substantially depopulated regions of the empire, especially there along the frontiers. So let's say they did it on the borders and not in the core lands of the Mediterranean, where the empire gravitated around. And the Slavs actually penetrate very deep into they arrive straight into the Peloponnese. Basically, there is this kind of rural dimension that all these southern Balkans get Slavicized, and the Romano-Hellenic element remains fundamentally into the cities, along the coasts, into this mostly maritime coastal dimension, right? And obviously, these two areas interact with each other, and the Slavs, in part, are successfully integrated into the empire, especially in these core lands. Towards the south, they become agricultural working labor force. But other Slavs settle into areas that are much more difficult to control, and in some cases they become more threatening, right? And there are definitely certain kind of tribal cores that emerge, and definitely the most threatening for the empire were, among the Slavs, were the Serbs, right, at this point. And you can't say they were a major threat all the time. Like they were pretty interesting population. and the fighting style of the Slavs was kind of recognized universally, even within Strategicon, at the beginning as mostly foot warfare, right? And the Slavic clans fought prevalently with infantry, largely with infantry, which doesn't mean they didn't have cavalry. They did, like every other single people at this time. But the reason why they had a few infantry wasn't even the fact that they didn't know how to, not because they didn't have access to horses particularly, or they were. The problem is that their society was very generally poor and less stratified. So actually, the popular element had a strong control in society. These were relatively egalitarian societies. Therefore, in this context, cavalry and relative oligarchies are not well seen. Obviously, the more time progresses, especially with sedentarization, the more certain wealth starts being accumulated, more certain oligarchies form, right? And the Slavs underwent this process of, especially in certain regions. Probably not in Serbia particularly, but that's a case, for example, of the Bulgarians. That's the case of the later of the Poles, really, partially also of the Russians, that they start developing actually very numerous cavalries, right? That they have difficulties to create something heavier, like it was happening in the West with the Franks, with heavy, a structural, solid amount of heavy professional cavalries. But the Slavs developed actually pretty widely mounted combat style. While in this area of the Balkans, in the mountains of say the Western Balkans, the Serbs developed mostly as infantrymen, and the ground is suitable for that, right? It's extremely tough to fight in the Balkans in certain areas of it. It's been like that throughout all history, and in fact, you can even say that all this band of territory that stretches from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, south of on the right bank of the Danube, is largely like a frontier area, right? The Byzantine Empire does control it nominally, and can control it, right? But it's the control of what an early medieval power can have on these territories, which means sending troops, armies, etc., but never quite controlling all the society there. Yet that's very important, because it's like hundreds of kilometers of horriful territory that basically shields the empire from, especially the Danubian Basin, where the Avar Khaganate at this point was developing. The party gets ruined when the Bulgars actually settle in what in Thrace would be roughly today's Bulgaria, and that is just next door to Constantinople. So that creates more problem. And the Serbs at this point are not still a clear unified entity. Like there are these Zupan chiefs that compete very highly on their own. These are pretty warlike peoples to start at least becoming. Like the Slavs are usually during this migration era portrayed as kind of relatively peaceful peoples, that even their migration didn't actually spark any major conflict and so on. But definitely, these are still societies like early medieval times, and there is a lot of competition between the various clans. There is generally a warlike society in the sense that the freeman is a warrior, and the same local resources, especially in these areas, do not allow really to live very peacefully. Like, everybody grows their crops and everything's fine, because resources are limited, and sometimes there is not even much of an option whether to declare war to someone else or to raid, because you don't have enough resources to live on your own. And the Slavs during this period, and this part explains the genesis of their equestrian capabilities, become also a problem, also because there are many. Like the Slavs are many, and they expand, as we've seen, very very widely. They become a problem when they are under the command of conquerors like the Bulgars or the Avars, right? You can see it very well for the Avars and for the Bulgars as well, is that passing from this Eurasian steppes into Europe, the population that they encounter first in Europe are obviously the Slavs in the eastern part, right? From the north, from the Baltic Sea to the Peloponnese, and therefore they're stronger because these are populations of the steppes. They're equestrian peoples that have a great power on their own. So they meet this scattered Slavic clans that do not have much of a national cohesion on their own, and they subjugate them. But yet, there is this myth, in fact, that the Slavs were now just kind of subservient to these powers, but the story is much more complicated than that. But as a result, for what the Byzantines are concerned now, what happens is that when these populations of the steppes arrive, they carry alongside with them lots of other peoples, right? Sometimes of Hunnic or Indo-European, Indo-Iranic descent, and then when they meet the Slavs, they also use them. Many Slavs start actually following the trail of these peoples and settling where they did, right? So this teaches them also a lot about their military combat style, and we don't have to be too dogmatic, like saying that all the cavalry of like the Bulgars or the Avars were just this allegedly Turkic populations from the steppes. It was plenty of lots of other peoples, including Slavs, quite easily once they arrived in Europe. And the following political and social transfer and also cultural transformations broadly meant will prove this clearly, like especially with the Bulgarians that we'll see later on, that they managed to absorb this partially Turkic but partially already Indo-European element, because peoples like the Bulgars or the Avars were so mixed that we actually know, even by certain archaeological evidence and philological evidence, that there were lots of Indo-Europeans with them already, from the same steppes. So the whole picture is much more shaded, as you understand. I won't get totally into the details, also because I don't know much myself about them. But it's very, very fascinating, and this is a part of European history that is also very important to understand, right? Aside from the various ethnical divisions of kind of the later centuries, nationalisms, etc. But the past of these areas is pretty damn amazing, and it's worth all the study dedicated to it. In fact, I hope to expand on Schwerpunkt, on all of these things, and hopefully learn more about them, because as I was just saying, I don't know much myself about them. So what the Byzantines noticed about the Serbians the Serbs in this context is that they would evolve into the Serbians, of course, but these are still kind of the ethnic tribal origin, the Serbs. This was mostly imagine the picture here: mountains, forests, a terrible, very few cities and urbanization. So these peoples fight pretty hit-and runs, guerrilla ambushes, and they're difficult to spot. Rarely they engage in open field, right? Because they have trouble even to organize large bodies of troops that can counter the imperial ones. They prefer rightfully and pretty damn effectively to resort to this kind of guerrilla fighting style. In winter, they were kind of more vulnerable because there are bare trees that offer little cover compared to the other seasons, and also their trails might be more visible in the snow, right? But generally speaking, also in winter, it's a bit of a myth that during winter, this times there were no military operations, but obviously there were way less than in the others in spring and especially in summer, because even in spring these areas are definitely not warm, right? So there are hell of places, but that's exactly, even winter warfare is sometimes attacking where it's the least expected, like especially with long nights. You have more time for covert operations in the darkness, and coups and assaults are like every day. So that's a relatively poorly documented area, but that's a hell of an environment in terms of warfare. Like it's pretty very, very tough. Some of the toughest you can ever imagine. The Slavs were also generally poor in weapons. All right, they didn't, as we've seen before, they were generally poor. They had a few stratification that had came out. Apparently, the ethnogenesis of the Slavs is fundamentally they came out from the Pripyat marshes area, right around. They expanded to several directions. Basically, they stayed in there because during the rest of the migration era, like there were stronger peoples that they kind of hid from in this marshlands, and then they come out where most of them are out, right? Just to be reinvested by these waves of nomadic, semi-nomadic populations. So it's very, very fascinating. But there were many. Like, they were poor in weapons, but there were many. They had strength in, like, a demographic strength. They preferred this kind of weapons, spears, javelins. A typical Slavic character is that this large rectangular shields that you find throughout several, a bit scattered a bit throughout all Slavic warfare during the Middle Ages, that suggest probably this is purely speculative from me, but it's probably the need of creating like very ordered and very extended shield walls to protect themselves from horse archers of the steppes. Like, that's the best thing I can come up with, because that's objectively functional to protecting yourself from projectiles. And the Byzantines also made a freaking lot of use of them, as we've seen with horse archer mercenaries and horse archery in Byzantine tradition on their own. So these are pretty clever tactics. And the Slavs prefer to ambush their enemies in woods and mountains, and if forced to fight in the open, right? If there was really no choice but to engage the enemy in open field, well, they relied mostly on this single wild infantry charge, which is basically the last resort for every people that basically lacks complex logistics. And cannot keep an army on the field for a long time. In fact, the Byzantine manuals simply say, especially for the Germans, I don't remember specifically for the Slavs, but they're kind of similar in warfare at this point. Just wait, like wear them out, because they don't have enough. Like once they ran out of their supplies, which usually don't have enough, they're very easy to take out, right? So in the absence of more sophisticated tactical capabilities, this single wide charge is objectively the best option, and do not underestimate it, right? Because there are many. They're tough. They're hard, even physically speaking. I mean, that they're habituated to pretty tough environments, as we've seen. So that's dangerous, right? Don't think that the Byzantines have, all the countermeasures in every situation. Every battle, every context is completely different. So sometimes this solution is actually pretty good, pretty effective. The Slavs did apparently make poor use of archery themselves, especially in these southern Slavs we're talking about now. But they did use, for example, poisoned arrows as well. They're pretty nasty. In addition to javelins, spears, knives. And similarly from the 8th century, also war axes. Don't tell me exactly why, whether also this is kind of a very reliable information, but my take on this is basically the 8th century is a moment of a bit of economical revival across all over Europe. So probably you can see more metal around, like swords, but also armor. The Slavs had a very few of this stuff, but they start having them probably more in this period. And when you find axes, you can see this as a blunt weapon, as a trauma weapon, that's pretty good against armor as well. So that can make sense as an explanation, but it's not. I mean, the Slavs didn't have axes before. Like they had, obviously, like any other people historically, but they probably axes start to be more widespread later on for this reason. That's just my take on that. I don't pretend it to be resolutive at all, as far as I understand. And naturally, the best equipped Slavic warriors would be the ruling elite, the oligarchs that surely also knew how to fight on horseback pretty damn well, and so that was the elite, and that they could afford the best equipment. So let's pass to the Bulgarians, right? Like Bulgars and Bulgarians, the difference is, the Bulgars are probably these peoples that came from Central Asia. Like the Bulgarians are the people that emerges later on as dominantly Slav, right? And the same modern people that exist today that has absorbed the Bulgars from the steppes. So as we were saying before, so that, for example, Bulgaria today speaks Slavic, while, for example, Hungary doesn't. Albeit it's not really like a Ographic country, like they're mostly kind of Slavicized on their own as well, ethnically speaking, but they retained, maybe because they had multiple migrations, like they had the Avars first, then the Hungars, and the Pannonian Plain was kind of the normal basin where all these peoples would go. In the case of the Bulgars, they migrate down south, as we've seen, up to Thrace, and the Bulgars are identified like a Turkic people, right, within the military tradition of Central Asian steppes, right? But as we've seen, that their background was way more composed, because in the steppe you have to think this, that when we talk about an ethnicity, it's not really to be meant genetically speaking, but mostly linguistically speaking. Like, it was a matter of being part of a people that had certain shared laws and then an attached language to it, but they, ethnically speaking, they basically accepted anyone, including subjugated populations, so that progressively would form like the bulk of the people as such. And even and especially also in the steppes, ethnic national cohesion, let's say, from a political point of view, and that is based on language largely, and these common laws, and especially demographic strengths are very, very, very important, because the steppes are also terrible, more terrible place than whatever you can find in Europe, and in the sense that resources are very limited, and it's a continuous clash for survival, especially in certain areas of it, because there are not just nomads out there in the steppes. Like, the steppes are also very diverse on their own, but there are large sanitary areas, etc. But from which these peoples come, these are nomads, right? And then they come from areas where warfare is all around. And so, to make the long story short, but it's very much more complicated. Basically, the first recorded state of the Bulgars is like in what would be today's southern Russia, and their state collapsed, whatever it was, in the mid-7th century, right? And after which they flee into the Balkans, and they established their nation is still known as Bulgaria, right? So what happens at this point, that this Turkic or whatever ruling elite of the new kingdom would be soon absorbed by its largely Slav subjects, right? Even Thrace, obviously before the Slavs had known other populations like the Thraco-Illyrians, and especially the Thracians. So there was already this kind of ethnic composition, but the Slavicization here is pretty intense. And these peoples of the steppes are not really that many compared to this sedentary Europe. So they get absorbed demographically and culturally by the Slavs in this territory. But it's interesting because, as we were saying before, the relation between conquerors and conquered in this context is much more shaded. Like, and the same Slavs are capable of exploiting this situation, like especially their elites, like joining this Turkic model was definitely the one of a much more stratified and hierarchized society for which they can acquire more power. So in spite of the progressive Slavicization of the Bulgars, still Bulgaria maintains a pretty sound hierarchy, right? That is able to, in fact, to use even against the Byzantines, and partly because they were Romanized in part as well. Like they were imitating Byzantine models of power, and even military ones, as we will see now, because they were just so close to Constantinople and to the Roman influence as a whole. And surely the Bulgars had ceased to be strictly nomadic before crossing the Danube in 679 AD. And they seem to have been very, very fast at adopting several Byzantine military know-how techniques, right? Bulgaria was also a rich country, telling the truth, that especially they were able, towards the decline of the Avar Khaganate in the Pannonian Plain, to extend their power north, certain gold and silver mines in the areas of the Carpathians. They were pretty well placed, even in terms of trade routes between Western and Eastern Europe, Southern and Northern and Southern Europe. So they were very powerful, and they accumulate a lot of wealth of power through which they can support kind of a sophisticated warfare, right? The Bulgars, as we've seen, were mostly in origin, they were semi-nomadic. They were basically all about this equestrian tradition of the steppes, and they're able to combine it with Byzantine military culture as well. And in 864 there is the conversion to Christianity, formally, that would evolve in turn within the creation of their own church, and that kind of also parallels the one of Constantinople, and also in terms of state and imperial models, right? And they become a great competitor of the same empire in the Balkans, and just as we were saying before, next door to Constantinople. There's an aristocracy of boyars that keeps providing the leadership and to advise the Khan, while there was this other figure, the Tarkhan, that served as the ruler's chief military officer. These people are, regardless of their ethnic origin, they immediately join into the equestrian model overall. Like probably even certain Slavs at this point, Slavic aristocrats join in. They learn this equestrian tradition of the steppes that was fairly unknown to us previously, and they start feeling it on their own. Like and so the Bulgarian cavalry remains pretty dreaded at this point, and feared rightfully by the Byzantines, that will also suffer terrible losses on their own. The heaviest one is the battle of Pliska, that was fought in the pass on the Verbitsa Pass, if I'm not wrong. I believe it's pronounced this way, on July the 26th, 811, between the Bulgarian Empire led by the Khan Krum and the Byzantine Empire under Nicephorus I, which ended with a decisive Bulgarian victory in the death of the same Byzantine emperor whose skull was taken by Khan Krum, and to be turned into a drinking cup of for the same Bulgarian leader. So this is a ruler. So this is this is the measure of Bulgarian threat to the empire and military effectiveness. As we were saying, the Turkic Bulgars formed originally this cavalry elite, but numerically speaking, the bulk of the army consisted of Slavic infantry, This is also pretty interesting. There's this combination since the very beginning of these two elements, right? Which is pretty strong. It's very interesting because from one side you have this the tactics, this cavalry tactics. They're used to harass the enemy, but at the same time you have this kind of stout, steady infantry block that can even provide cover for cavalry and even standing against other cavalry assaults, and so it's pretty interesting combination. The Khan had its own personal retinue that was regarded in Constantinople like a bodyguard, and probably consisted of personal companions armed in the steppes tradition, right? Traditionally speaking, and so heavy cavalry at that point. In the steppes you have this ultra elite of pretty damn heavily armored cavalry, and then this human tide of like completely unarmored horse archers. So naturally here it's not the steppes anymore, but still the bodyguard is maintained, right? And probably there are changes over time, like probably these populations progressively lost even their their equestrian capabilities, like they had been the one of the steppes originally speaking. But never forget that the Bulgarians and their large empire that they have managed to build in the Balkans is still exposed to other populations coming from the steppes, from the northeast. Think about the Pechenegs. And so I made a video about the Battle of Bulgarofigan. If you're interested about that, it's pretty interesting because it shows that actually, and how on several occasions, like the Bulgarians had to deal both with Byzantines and like peoples of the steppes. The same Constantinople had called from the north to attack the Bulgarians. So it was typical Byzantine international foreign policy, like turning one people against one another, as we were saying before. So especially the early Bulgarian army was more effective in raids or ambushes than open battle, right? Which is typical also in here of the steppes, steppe warfare, like because before the ultra elite engages, it's better to wear the enemy out with this constant harassment of horse archers that are extremely agile, and especially in this Balkanic territory that can be very very useful, right? You can't say the Balkans are good ground for cavalry as a whole, but still, the small bands of raiders, etc., they're pretty damn effective in these territories, and still that there is infantry as well, as we have seen. So that also the Slavs are famous because they kind of were considered like fanatic defenders, like in many chances, in many occasions, and especially good at defending like their villages, they're from within their woods. So also they're being pretty able to organize ambushes and stuff like that. So and that's a pretty damn bad combination for cavalry, because cavalry doesn't get into the woods, especially when defended by infantry. That's the same reason for example, while the Mongols, when they will invade Russia, they will come to direct only to rule directly just the steppes area, while the forest one was guarded by these local Slavic communities that, like, they became kind of tributaries and clients, but they managed to maintain their own autonomy, because not even Mongol cavalry was pretty much at ease into those woods, right? So naturally, a lot of Bulgarian war, especially very early Bulgarian warfare, has still to do with raids, right? Also because given that the statal structure was yet to be formed, the booty was the reward in the stead of pay, right? That wasn't there was no way to deliver it, like functionally speaking, with an organization and an administration, etc. So just loot and that's your pay, right? And that's what the peoples of the steppes do at the end of the day. However, at the time of Khan Krum, so as we've seen at the beginning of the 9th century, Bulgarian warfare had regularized, was more organized, and had even earned a reputation in siege warfare. Now, this is very important. Siege warfare is a very important indicator of a people's military advancement at this point, because basically the Hellenistic Roman polyurcetic standards had remained unmatched in Europe. The Byzantines had the best siege equipment, tactics, resources, etc. Just the Sassanid Persians had managed to counter them in some measure, but at this point, like everything of that, especially the classical polyurcetic tradition was spreading like a source. Like all these peoples that came to gravitate around Constantinople, around the empire, more or less learned polyurcetics, and not just that, from the Byzantines. So siege warfare, however, is not for everybody. Like there are peoples, as we explained to you before, that can be exposed like for forever with this kind of warfare, but that will not adopt it, because essentially in their own land it's of no use. It's a case of peoples of the steppes. They're always gravitated into this Black Sea area, this Pontic area, but never learned that, because objectively they didn't need it, because they didn't have cities on their own. The Bulgarians in here start having like fairly important centers at this point. Nothing comparable with Roman urbanization, etc., but still important. And they develop a siege warfare on their own. They even deal there are very interesting interactions even with Longobard Italy at this point, that had a lot, especially they had some naval engineering resources that were sent to Bulgaria to fight against the Byzantines, who were common enemies. So there is this evolution of siege techniques that speaks for it, because basically for these peoples it was a big deal of having achieved that level of military organization. You can't see even process of Christianization, certain changes in military culture, like the Turkic horsetail banners were replaced with Christian flags in the process. That's very interesting. These are traditions from the steppes you can find in other peoples that even that came to be enemies of the empire, like the Seljuk Turks later on. And in this case, the process of Christianization substitutes even these practices, even though definitely these peoples will always maintain in their military, in their national identity in some way, this idea that they were the conquerors of the steppes. Like they were horsemen, they were chiefly mounted warriors, and there's a great prestige attached to that eventually will evolve into this, because of Western influence, into feudalism in some measure. That was never at its fullest in the Balkans, but because if anything, it's the paranoia of the Byzantine model that spreads in this area. But later on, Western influence, even on Bulgaria after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1204, is important, because the French were just next door there, and Bulgaria was the major threat to them. And paradoxically, it's Bulgarian exploits that will afford the Palaiologi dynasty to retake control of Constantinople, right? But that's a later and another story. The Christianization also entailed partial, let's say, institution of a military code of behavior. Like at this point, actually no power, Byzantines included, really gave a damn about military codes of behavior, right? It's not that people cared about that. But there is, there is a sort, like when two peoples kind of become similar and they share some cultural aspects, and they're kind of neighbors, like in this case, and so they're also, there's a cyclical warfare going on. This doesn't mean that fair play begins, but there is a bit of ritualism attached toward it. At one point, triggers the necessity to idealize this kind of warfare, for which, okay, let's play this game of war in a much more controlled way, like, given we know what it's going to be about largely. And this has nothing to do with what effectively happens. Like, take the great Khan Simeon, from looking at how he slit the noses of all his Byzantine captives when he captured them. And it was the same battle of Bulgaria, if I'm not wrong, or another occasion, I don't remember actually. But just for saying, there was, like, that word was really brutal, and I mean really brutal. But still, there is a kind of mutual respect, kind of mutual understanding, and sometimes these things could be avoided, right? And even such an episode like Simeon slitting noses of Byzantine captives is mostly an exception, and dictated by some deterrent effect we wanted to achieve in certain. It's a form of it's a political action, right? It has nothing to do with war in itself, even though tortures and other kinds of violence were common at the time. In any case, the Byzantines, actually, because the Byzantine sources are most of what we have actually about Bulgarian armies. Like the 8th century Bulgar army is described by Byzantines like attacking in ordered ranks. Quote by Emperor Leo VI, treatise, unlike all other Scythian nations. This is very important because that Leo VI, the Wise, writes this tactic is another military treatise. He describes the Bulgars at the time were definitely a problem for the empire, and he notices this, that even though first of all they are assimilated to the Scythian nations, because the Byzantines wrote still with classical names and this literary anachronisms, for which all the peoples of the north were the Scythians, because the Byzantines were in love with the classical world, and therefore they called this in the name of they called the peoples that inhabited certain areas with the name of the peoples that inhabited them in classical times. So here the Bulgars were the Scythians, and surely there were some kind of Scythian Sarmatic descendants into the Bulgars at that time, for sure, but they had nothing to do with that. And Scythian actually means here like nomadic peoples, like these nomadic peoples of the Pontic steppes, fundamentally, that evidently, like the Bulgars were here occupying a territory that was not occupied by the Scythians back in the day, but they were recognized as such, like in terms of fighting style and this broad origin. But it's therefore an exception here in the exception, because he says that these troops were, like the Bulgarian armies were ordered in ranks while attacking, which was what no other nomadic people did at the time, which means that the Byzantines were recognizing how the Bulgarian settlement into Thrace had brought to some sort of more advanced military organization that has nothing to do with a peculiar strictly Bulgar tradition. It has to do with the fact that now they had grown, they had become something more than people of the steppe, and they had this more intense military organization. There is during this time even a small corps of military engineers appearing into Bulgarian armies. That speaks for those siege warfare capabilities. On arms, armor, and arsenals of the Bulgarian Empire were regularly inspected, and you can't even come as far to say that there were permanent troops, right? There is this idea that permanent troops appear just into the modern age. No, basically they always existed everywhere. Like there is always, if anything, think about the bodyguards that are literally living like professionals of warfare. Like those are permanent forces objectively in all times in history. But here probably the Bulgarians even had developed a small yet kind of elite units of permanent forces that could be maintained in case of emergency. It could intervene, like small but effective units like special forces, something like that. That were quite important, especially for an empire that was so extended like the Bulgarian one, and it had this constant troubles on its own, right? Aside from the Byzantine perspective. So the Bulgars back in the day had been Sumakoi of the empire, which means the Greek equivalent of the Latin federati. That is allies, right? Sumakos meaning friend, essentially. In fact, they had basically been settled by the Byzantines in Thrace and Eastern Macedonia at the time of Justinian II as a bastion against Avar invasion, right? This was also typical, as you see, using a people as a shield fundamentally against another one. And what happens is that throughout all this coexistence between these two neighbors, Bulgarian prisoners of war and also slaves and other captives, let's say, continued to be enlisted by the Byzantines in their own armies, right, during the 8th and the 9th century. So this is important because throughout all this time you find Bulgarians that fought into the Roman army and knew what it was about, and that's where also the Bulgarian military was growing so effectively at that point. Talking about their fortification, obviously the Bulgarian developed a certain territorial organization with forts, etc. And in part they copy from Western models, in part they actually bring something on their own that reflects certain traditions that go as far as Central Asia. How they got those and kept getting that, we don't really know. Obviously they had come from those places, but it's remarkable how also certain traditions survived into their military engineering as well. And always remember the contact that they kept having with peoples of the steppes throughout all this time, right? This is not just the Byzantine Empire here. Talking about the Georgians at this point. So, medieval Georgia consisted chiefly of Lazika, I don't know how you say that, on the Black Sea coast, and Iberia inland to the east. So this is important because Lazika had been heavily Romanized in a certain dimension. That had seen even before Hellenic colonies interacting with it. Iberia was internal. It's into inland, so this area is more savage. It's more kind of tribal in character. There is a third northern region, the one of Abkhazia, where there's this very particular geographical area where the Caucasus Mountains come down to the Black Sea. So it's a very it's like a stripe of land, like mountain and sea, very close. It's very fascinating, and it goes up to like towards the Ukraine fundamentally, like in roughly, not really. It's still very far because the coasts there are very long. But it's a composite. It's a composite picture, like into this Black Sea area. So Iberia was at this time the heartland of the medieval Georgia, and Georgia is very interesting because it's had converted to Christianity in 330 AD, so basically formally even before the Roman Empire. And Albite pagans kept existing for other 200 years, or even more, because telling the truth, how you can distinguish local traditions with, there was a coexistence of Christianity with certain forms of paganism. The ruling dynasty of Iberia at this point was of Iranian origin, and therefore this region was exposed to many influences. Like from one side you had the Greek one, the Persian one, even the steppes one was important there, because the Caucasus, it's there, and then across it just the steppe. The properly Roman one at one point, and others that are added at this point, of course, like even with the Islamic invasions, this various cultures that pour in. So in the 6th century, Iberia is overthrown by the Sasanians, right? That kind of impose a more or less direct rule, while the Byzantines kept holding Lazica. So as a consequence, this entire area became a battleground between the two empires, right? That, as you know, was a secular clash, and it ends for a while with the Byzantine triumph at the Battle of Nineveh in 627, when the Sasanians are destroyed fundamentally. But still, Iranian culture lives on. So this Caucasus is, even as with Armenia, we will see later, even its military culture does resent a lot what Persian culture had been, also in military affairs, since the time of the Achaemenids, roughly. And it's still a very peculiar land, like very diverse territory, but with certain particular local traditions, and yet this influence even of the steppes and etc. Actually, this area is kind of sedentary, so there's not probably semi-nomadic populations, if not in small groups, but it's still exposed to warfare of the steppes. Also, this area is very overlooked historically. Like, it has a beautiful history in general. The other major changes after a generation, like in the second half of the 7th century at this point, both Iberia and the northern part of Lazica, albeit not Abkhazia, submitted voluntarily to Islamic rule, right? Which was a compromise, because the caliphate never quite reached a direct control of those places, but still, basically, this submission allowed the Islamic Empire to have this outlet onto the Black Sea, so also a matter of trade routes and all. So these were very important areas for trade routes. The Romans and the Sassanids had been fighting so much for Lazica, essentially because that's where part of the Silk Road passes through, like weird contacts between East and West. So this was fundamental overall, and it's part of a much broader strategic theater that stretches up to like the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in Arabia. Like, this is where all the traffics between China and Europe pass. So it's of incredible strategic importance as an asset. So Tbilisi, which is still the capital of Georgia, flourished actually under Muslim princes at this point, and it was a fairly widespread conversion to Islam. But the Christian warriors, Christian warrior aristocracies continued to exist, especially in the mountains. Like it's very frequent in this context. And as a consequence, especially areas like Abkhazia in the north, providing mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire against the Muslims. This is typical because the Muslims basically substitute to the Romans in certain area. Like they the caliphate expands into this great kind of sedentary, fertile territories with a high level of urbanization. And instead, it's in the mountains that there is the toughest resistance sometimes, and sometimes it has nothing probably to do with religion itself. I mean, there were even certain sects of heretical sects of Islam that take refuge in certain areas of Anatolia, for example, at the outskirts of the caliphate. Well, Abkhazia, as these mountain territories, they're generally feudal in nature. Like, there are all these strongholds of lords that have this traditionally warrior culture, right? That keep on fighting against the Muslims, right? It's also because it's not just because of their religion. It's mostly because the Muslims hold the fertile land, the agricultural plains. So these guys from the mountains, they're just like hawks that strike into these places and they raid, and they live out of this wealth that they loot, right? In general, however, the Georgian military effort was directed against the pro-Byzantine and anti-Islamic Khazar Turks that lived north of the Caucasus. So overall, these were their neighbors that they didn't like at all. And you know that the Khazars basically were allies with the Byzantines. They even converted partially to Judaism. Actually, some of them converted to Christianity and to Islam alike, but they were mostly Jewish, at least part of their elites. And this was a way just to be acceptable at the eyes of the Byzantines. In fact, there were even some marriages, like conversion to Christianity, for political reasons. And the Georgians usually fought against the Khazars. So this posed them overall in kind of a more antagonistic relation with Constantinople than else. But yet their mercenaries were employed into Byzantine armies as well. So talking about the Armenians now. So the Armenians have actually great importance in Byzantine military history throughout all its period, we can say. They, especially throughout the 3rd and 9th century, they had actually a very high military reputation. It was also very well deserved. Armenia had been occupied by the Sasanians after the death of Julian in 363 and the treaty that Rome had signed with Persia. And at this time, Armenia was already Christian. Also, Armenia was Christian before the Roman Empire, and Armenia is characterized by a pretty troublesome warrior aristocracy that you could define like largely feudal in the essentials. Is actually very similar to the Persian one, culturally speaking, from a military point of view, in the sense that Persian military culture is mostly feudal, and Armenia had absorbed since Hellenistic times a freaking lot of Persian military models of military organization. This had made it also very effective. And the aristocracy was segmented with these major princes known as Ishkhans. In fact, it reveal a pretty intense Persian influence even in the name. And then the lesser Nakarars, that are basically the general nobility, right? Each one having their own castles. So just like in feudalism, right? The Nakarars were, as all noblemen and men of war, not only professionals of war, but also like mercenaries, right? Armenia is not enormously it has very important resources, but it's not an overwhelmingly wealthy area at this point. So many of these noblemen would seek fortune by fighting for other armies, right? Including the Byzantine one that paid pretty damn well for such highly skilled troops. So in the late 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Maurice cultivates especially these Nakarars, right, and even settles part of them around the city of Bergama. It would be Pergamon, right, in today's Turkey, Bergama, into western Anatolia, which is right on the Aegean Sea, so a very central land, like a very core land. This tells you how much the Byzantines cared about having this Armenian troops readily available in the core of the empire. And there is an increase in Armenian military importance in Byzantine armies during the 7th century, and there is even mention of a 2,000 armored cavalry elite on the Danube that of Armenians that are stationed by the Byzantines on the Danubian frontier to counter the Avars. The Avars, for today, we won't be talking about them because they're not strictly auxiliaries of the Byzantines, but in the Strategicon, the same Maurice considered them basically the strongest enemy of the empire from a tactical point of view. So, in order to send the Armenians there, these Nakarars, these Armenian troops must have been like pretty damn good. And some Armenians were used to defend the city of Constantinople itself, right? Armenian troops played also a very prominent role in the unsuccessful Byzantine defense of Syria against the Muslim Arabs, right? There are several peoples at this point that in the Near East, in these areas of the Caucasus as well, that participate alongside the Byzantines to stem the Islamic advance. As you know, it's a failure as the Byzantines lose it, and as a consequence, Armenia is conquered by the same Muslims. And there is to say in this that this Armenian nobility was pretty, troublesome, as we have seen, and therefore, while probably the majority of the Armenian nobility sided with the Byzantines, some Nakarars are witnessed to have supported the Islamic invasion as well. So this is normal. These were simply mercenaries that were being in the service of the best payer, right? And that's how it went. And in fact, back in the day, the same Armenia had, excuse me, been a battleground between Rome and Persia, so that on several occasions Armenia was split into at least two spheres of influence that also divided the same Armenian nobility internally, right? Because they had different, they were enticed by the various both contenders needed the support of the local nobility, so they kind of paid them well for their services. And the same goes when the Sassanids are wiped out and the Muslims arrive. Also, when the Byzantines, as we will see, will be able to reconquer parts of Armenia itself. But it's not that the Armenians liked the Romans much on their own. Their ideal would have been to remain alone, of course, but so that they were not particularly trusted in general. In fact, Armenia was also the only part of the long Byzantine Islamic frontier not to be depopulated by the wars during the 8th and 9th centuries, because this was an area that was relatively decentralized, both from Constantinople and the Caliphate, whatever was either in Damascus or in Baghdad. So the Armenians enjoyed fair autonomy on their own, and there is also the Paulician sect, that is this group that lived somewhat south. The Paulicians were a Christian adoptionist set from the same Armenia that originated from the 7th century apparently, that was almost surely influenced by Gnostic movement and also the religion of Marcionism and Manichaeism. So they were actually pretty similar, just to make you understand, to the Cathars, to the Bogomils that were basically a part of at one point, and even of the Shia, certain like the Ismailis. That basically these were all Neoplatonic heresies of either of Christianity or Islam, and they were, however, also kind of powerful political and military entities on their own. This Armenian community was crushed at one point by the Byzantines between the 8th and the 9th century, and as you know, obviously the Byzantines were pretty concerned about orthodoxy, but as it was a practice of this time, as we have remembered, demographic resources were pretty important. They did not get exterminated, but they're actually, I mean, part of them were actually telling the truth, but the remnants were, however, resettled by the Byzantine Empire into the Balkans, where that's exactly where they actually survive, and they would give rise later on to the radical sect of the Bogomils that the Byzantines will have to take care of once again, basically creating, waging the only true crusade in Byzantine history. As you know, the Byzantines didn't really conceive the concept of crusade, but in the case of the Bogomils, they had become such a threat in the Balkans that they need to basically mount several expeditions to literally wipe them out. And albeit they get butchered down brutally, many of them still survive, and they also give rise, they go. In fact, we were talking about the Cathars. Probably, quite likely, were contacts between these areas. So because such phenomena basically revive at the same time, at one point in 12th century. Other Paulicians and Bogomils actually managed to flee to Islam, to the Islamic terrorists. They were somewhat more tolerant, relatively more tolerant, but at that point also more fragmented, so there was more space for them there. The Paulicians seem to have served mostly as cavalrymen. They were believed to regard Jesus Christ as the Son, which is a typically Neoplatonic / emanatistic solar ideal. You know, that the sun is this light from which everything emanates, and the matter is. These were heretics because essentially they refused the bodily nature of Christ. So they even refused the cross as an object. That's a very big reason for which they were in fact persecuted by Orthodoxy, because it's really a radical take on Christian religion from a Nicene perspective. In part, Armenia was the Paulicians were actually part of their territory was occupied by the Muslims, with colonists, or sometimes even by Orthodox Armenians themselves, so that this gap getting filled practically, and it starts also spreading Armenians further south, bringing them eventually up to the Mediterranean coast, so that the Armenians get spread progressively throughout a very great area during this point. In the meanwhile, Armenia also starts developing at this point on its own, probably also thanks to these contacts and the fact that they were in the middle of the two empires, also even with trade and this preferential position, let's say. The main powers, the main principalities of Armenia at this point are the Bagratids in the north and the Artsruni in the south. And there were also kind of Arab / Armenian emirates around the lake then, because that opens basically to the Tigris Valley, and there were many Muslim powers there. So it's a very hybrid region right? And some of them were actually tributaries of the Caliphate itself. So they were basically within the Islamic Empire rather than the Byzantine one. And in fact, in this submission, these Armenian powers, they had to provide 1,500 cavalry when needed to the caliphs, and this Arab Armenian Emirates around Lake Van were a very thorn in the side, a real turn in the side for the Byzantines, before being crushed by the same empire and the Kurds that we will talk about later on. So, and also by the Amdanid rulers of Aleppo, that at one point were actually allies with the Byzantines. At one point they were wiped out by the same Byzantines. Some say it was a massive strategic mistake because they were kind of a buffer state between Byzantine Empire and Islam, like hostile Islam and whatever. But it's still important that the Armenians throughout all this period spread, and they even reach posts of high command in Constantinople, right? And this speaks for their entrepreneuriality, their dynamism, their force as a people. And obviously the Byzantines are never they never fully like the Armenians, nor the Armenians like them. But in fact, there is even this dark picture of the Armenians that they were kind of careless sentries in the Byzantine service, because they kind of didn't like the Byzantines. After all, they were there for the pay, but probably they were good as any other mercenary at the time. It's just many people think like the Middle Ages were, or the ancient world, where people didn't care about ethnic origins. So no, they did. There wasn't racism, because racism is born like this as this pseudo-scientific theory in the 19th century, but in these previous centuries was xenophobia. That definitely was, and the Byzantines were generally not very open towards these external peoples. Yet this cliches, these stereotypes emerged because they eventually there was a strong contact with them, right? The manpower of Armenia as a whole has been estimated throughout this period like between 25,000 40,000 men. Actually, in the beginning, before like the 7th century. Afterwards, it becomes a bit more difficult to find such numbers. This is simply the collapse of late antique society in that world, and the crumbling of the economy, the demographic crisis, the pandemics, the plague, etc. So Armenia also becomes medieval, right? Like all the rest of the world at this point. So this demographic resources cannot display it anymore. Nevertheless, Armenian forces during the time remained large, right? Considering the time. And especially Armenia was like a bastion on its own. Like it was very heavily fortified. It was a very tough terrain. It was full of castles. Many of them you still can see today, and they had this very defensivistic attitude. Around in the province of Vaspurakan, east of Lake Van alone, 70 castles were said to have existed at the time. And it seems that even villages, churches, and monasteries were fortified, and this definitely is a form of encapsulation that develops from these waves of these movements, this instability around Armenia that rendered this community very sensible to self-defense, but it also speaks for actually a militarized society from the within, and also the clashes between the same Armenians, right? In the 4th century, so very early in time, but it probably reflects an ability that the Armenians maintained for a long time. Armenians meant to have had certain special corps of mountaineers that were specialized essentially in rolling rocks onto their foes, and to jump on rocks and to attack the enemies, like on this very tough terrain on the mountain slopes that were evidently used to because they had been raised in Armenia. There is even in Armenian siege warfare a sort of iron hook that was used to help them scale walls, and certain large leather shields that were put on their back, so that they could be better defended from rocks being dropped from the above. Which, I mean, it's not probably leather does anything, but it's better than nothing against a stone that arrives on your back. So there's very physical dimension of Armenian warfare that is very bloody. Like, it's very I don't know how to say that. So you can smell it, the hurt in there. Like this very beautiful Armenian landscape dominated by mountains and this kind of extreme territory, like for this. Altimetrically speaking, also. So it's very fascinating, and this shaped local military culture. As we have seen, Armenia functioned a bit like a feudal system. So the military service was usually regarded to be linked with the possession of the land, and every nobleman had its own retinue of freemen under his own banner. And Armenians were pretty good cavalrymen as well. Here the Persian and steppes tradition was adopted in substantial part by the local warfare. And also Armenian equipment was highly regarded. In fact, Armenia is rich in iron. And maybe because of this, Armenian armor was regarded as particularly heavy compared to others at the time. And Armenian horses were often armored more often than the ones of other peoples. So this is kind of like shock troops, like even cataphracts, you could say, meaning, armored, partially armored troops. Actually, this is not the full cataphracts of the, especially during early medieval times. But there's still kind of some of the heaviest cavalry you can find around, one of Nakarars. And there are certain Arabic historians said that from the 10th century, Armenian warfare saw the spread of war axes. Also in here, I don't know how to comment it personally. It may be like more armor was spread at this point. Who knows? You needed war axes to crash it. It's possible. And there is a passage that is worth the read, written by the Armenian chronicle Stephanus Orbelian, that talks about this warrior. As we see, this is a literary model. It's not to be taken realistically, but it's very poetic and it's worth the read. Quote, having taken his armament and decked his superb body with a shining royal cuirass adorned with pearls, he put on an helmet topped with a tiger's head and girded his waist with a sword. Then throwing a golden shield upon his left shoulder and a strong spear in his right hand, he sprang upon his black steed and dashed at the enemy. Right, so this is the picture of an Armenian cavalryman that is evidently portrayed fundamentally like a knight, right? Knighthood here is a proper term. Like knighthood is developing here. We are in the 10th century. and you know that even Europe is developing that. The Persians have that. So the Armenians fit in. Also, even the Byzantines at this point have very heavily armored fighters, excellent, superb individual professionals of warfare. So here there is a kind of shared military culture that is developing in different areas of the world that are, however, here in contact with each other. And this passage is definitely echoing, however, especially in the description of the equipment, the one of a Persian knight of the late 10th century in the Shahnameh epic, and as well as the hero of the 12th century, the Georgian man in the panther's skin. That is an epic that probably reflects a common military as well as literary heritage between Armenia and this kind of Persified, Persianized Caucasus that they're part of. So this is interesting because it's just a literary model, but it tells you so much probably just through it about the massive influences that existed in the Caucasus from especially the Sasanian, the Persian influence right at this point. That is the same one that is Persianizing the Turks, for example, like the Seljuks that are spreading like this point, all the Gulams that the Caliphate assumes they all pass through Persia, and they have this very highly chivalric military code that is a mix in turn between Persian chivalry and the military edicts of the steppes and so on. There is a comparable Armenian epic known as David of Sassoon that is dated to 10th century, and here Armenian horsemen play this game that is virtually identical to the later Turkic Tsirit or the Arab Jarid, which is basically this hurling blunted javelins at each other, or even with actual pointy tips against certain targets on this cavalry training ground. So these are this is a kind of a sports that are to be found still today in those regions, and that all descend from this amalgamation of military traditions. Some people say, this dates back as far as the Roman Hippica Gymnasia, right? This basically cavalry training exercises that are allegedly passed from the Byzantine Empire to Armenia, but these are much longer traditions, like much older traditions that date back to who knows when. Like today in Eastern Anatolia, the Turkish game of Tsirit, it can still be seen, right? And it's plenty throughout, even I think Persia, surely in Afghanistan, of all these games of horsemen that were used to train troops. That is typical of this kind of quasi-feudalized areas, where horsemanship is so important, where the steppe military culture is very heavy, where the local lords are basically horsemen by tradition, and riding a horse is also a matter of a social status that is eventually very highly regarded, right? So Armenian military culture is powerful at this point, and they really produce some of the finest troops, also as auxiliaries of the Byzantine army, as we've seen. I think a shorter mention of the Kurds is important. The Kurds are this extremely ancient people, as you know, that we could spend countless time saying where the origins of the Kurds were. However, they probably emerged. Let's say, aside from their specificities, they probably have mixed influences from the Semitic and Armenian background. Albeit the Kurd as a language is actually a Western Iranian tongue, right? They're Indo-Europeans, by the way, but also evidently mixed, very heavily mixed with other surrounding populations. The Kurds have somehow this great importance in this period between especially the 8th and the 10th century. And at this point they were basically incorporated within the Islamic Caliphate, but they as Constantinople expands its empire from the 10th and 11th century towards the east into eastern Anatolia, the Byzantines do encounter Kurds, and they fight them on some occasion, and they also hire them as mercenaries. The Kurds are radically tough mountaineers. They're extremely sturdy and wild troops that the Byzantines have difficult to contain as well, because, for example, many people think that, like with Manzikert, everything like was lost, that Anatolia was open to anyone, like before it was just Byzantine territory. Absolutely not. Actually, Anatolia was very permeable, and actually the main problem of the Byzantines at that point had been chiefly the Kurds, because the Kurds were like entering into Byzantine territory and settling already into Anatolia, and they would keep doing that even after the disaster of Manzikert and the spread of the invasion of the Seljuks and the settlement in Anatolia, and it was plenty of Kurds as well. So some important mention is to be made for the Ghassanid Arabs, that are this very fascinating tribe, we could say, tribal group fundamentally. I made a video on Pre-Islamic Arabia that explains that a little bit. Basically, as you know, the Arabs Arabia had an enormous civilization, especially in the south, what would be today's Yemen. And that would be where the Saba came from, the famous queen, that partly a mythical figure. Those were peoples that had a real civilization, especially with the Madab. I don't remember what's the name of the dam that provided this extensive agricultural production that at this time in late antique times actually collapses and therefore creates a massive shock in the area, and there is a further desertification. But let's say the other Arab peoples in the north, as we know, they were kind of tribesmen. They were semi-nomadic peoples, but they were always in contact with the great advanced civilization of Mesopotamia and Mediterranean. So they always gravitated around that, and they had joined partly these greater empires. They had served in part under the Persians, and some under the Romans. And the Ghassanids are some of the most important of Roman Arab auxiliaries. And in the Middle East, so the Arab Federati, right, were sometimes directly in part they settled into the Roman frontiers in Nabatea, fundamentally, on their own. In part they were actually invited by the same Romans. They were fairly good federati because they didn't cause much trouble, telling the truth. They waged war like on their own account sometimes, but they didn't reverse their weapons much against Rome. They were mostly interested in fighting against in the desert against the Arab Lakhmids that were instead settled by the Sassanids in their Iraqi frontier. This is very interesting because Ghassanids and Lakhmids were in fact fighting respectively for the Romans and the Persians, and they were in part still fighting, of course, like Arabs, but they received massive military influences from these two empires that, as you know, were basically the most advanced of the time in the area. and therefore they get acquainted with this kind of military culture. In fact, especially in the case of the Lakhmids, it seems that after the Islamic invasion, many Lakhmids participated, like taught a lot to Muslim armies, teaching them the same things that they had learned in turn from this extensive warfare between the Romans and the Persians. And this the Ghassanids, coming back to the strictly Byzantine perspective, were also used, of course, as a buffer state to contain the frontier tribes of Arabia that obviously wanted to raid into wealthier territory. And there were at one point, telling the truth, the relations with Rome were not always happy, but somewhat the system held, right? These were largely sedentarized peoples at this point, and the Ghassanid leadership lived into villages around along the frontiers. They had castles, like palaces, fortified palaces with their own guards and fortifications. This aristocracy was known as the Philarchs, right? And they were also fairly numerous people that founded villages towns and villages on their own. They built forts and markets and churches and monasteries, because these were actually being converted to Christianity as well. And the at one point, however, they were regarded as heretics because they were supporting the Syriac Jacobite Church in the area. And yet, Christianization here was not an option. Like they converted to Christianity anyway, in spite of this heretical, like the kind of different orientations, let's say. And the empire paid the Philarchy as the Philarchs, like as federati. Actually, they received the regular annona allowance that was basically the either monetary or largely also natural resources that were used as supplies, etc. And it was mostly because of the army, right? That for maintaining the troops. And in fact, the system worked decently at the point that by the 6th century, the Byzantine regular troops had abandoned the border to the same Philarchs that controlled it on their behalf. However, the Romano Byzantine presence was revived, especially in the wars between the Sassanids that were fought just along that frontier in part. So, yeah, and you can say the Ghassanids, had a monarchy on their own, but they were never fully independent in this sense, and they were always kind of a client state of Rome. It's not that they had much power on their own. And these troops fought chiefly as light cavalry, which also caused them some problem when they had to meet the heavier Sasanian cavalry in open field on that frontier. But that's an asymmetry that can be compensated in different ways. And some Ghassanid contingents were used, for example, by Heraclius, even very far from their home, like into Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea. So these were troops that also traveled extensively. That they knew what the general military culture was about in the area, and so they were probably very good as well. They were even employed to put down some anti-Christian revolts by the Samaritans of Palestine. Aside from the Ghassanids, were other Arabs that were paid by the empire along especially the Sinai Peninsula. Those were important chiefly because they controlled the caravan routes between Syria and Egypt, and therefore these were like a protection in the area that watched over the other Mordeers, etc. Obviously, they got something in exchange, right? So it was a bit of a hush money at the end of the day. And the Arab frontier of the Byzantine Empire was shattered, however, by the Sasanian occupation of Syria and Egypt in the early 7th century before Heraclius' counterstrike. And especially there is this point that is rightly before the spread of Islam, for which this frontier had been destabilized. So many, especially like the sedentary Arabs, like the Ghassanids, remained faithful even during the anti-Islamic, like the Islamic invasions. But certain other Bedouin tribes started seeing that they could seize something, right, from the empire, and this probably was in the air already when Muhammad was preaching, and these people, even from the Hijaz, knew what was going on there, and they probably started thinking they could make a way through that as it would happen, right? And there is all history here, like of all the wars against the Arabs in that context. But let's say that the Ghassanids generally they defended, for example, Damascus against the Muslims in 634. Like, they were full Romanized in the sense they understood what the benefits of the empire were and decided with trying to counter these Muslim forces that at the beginning were actually no different than just Mordeers. That they probably felt the change in the sense they understood that this was a collapse of the system, but they preferred to stand to try to defeat this new power emerging, albeit they were Arabs just like them. So this is important because it shows you the achievements of Romanization in the process, right? And there was even some polyurcetic that they learned in Roman service. In fact, they erected some fortifications. They were saying defense of Damascus to counter the Muslims, right? A minor yet interesting and important on its own regard element are the Berbers, the North African Berbers, Berber tribes that actually were. I made a video on the Battle of Mammes. 534 that shows you like how the Berbers began to put themselves in movement, like against the Byzantine held coast of North Africa. But there were actually lots of Berbers that forged long-standing alliance with the Byzantine Empire. The Musulami were the most important among them, and there were other troops that were settled on the frontier as limitani, so as the troops on the frontier that were fundamentally granted some land by the Byzantines, saying you occupy this and you stem other raiders coming from the desert. Yeah, and that's what they did in some measure. And the Berbers were regarded as some of the finest light cavalries out there at the time. And however, when they sanitarized, they started also being trained by Roman officers to start learning. They sanitarized. They started learning how they start building forts. They had their own arsenals, so they progressively sedentarized. They can become Roman in part, and albeit they maintain, of course, in this environment their light cavalry capabilities. They were part now the Roman like a regional defense, and they were deployed on other fronts by the Byzantine military in other areas. And sometimes these troops were actually used as, they were actually in service of like independent Berber princes that sent their troops in the service of the Byzantine Empire as mercenaries, right? Being paid back. So this is important. However, as you know, after Justinian's reconquest, the Berbers start mostly overwhelming Byzantine coastal outposts, and this naturally progressively erodes Byzantine control of the area that will, however, be invested by the Islamic invasion and lost. Now, I would like to focus now on some numbers, like that can tell you how heavily the Byzantines relied numerically on these troops. So by the mid-10th century, consider that the Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus recorded the possibility of avoiding military service by paying a so-called aderatio, which is basically a tax exemption that was a way to say like that the thematic armies of the empire could be basically unattended, like by the recruits, if just by paying money in exchange. This was a process that happened for many reasons at the time, also because of the unreliability of the army, but also because people didn't want, especially of the regional armies that had proven unloyal in some measure, but simply because the local sedentary population didn't want to leave home to go to military expeditions. So it was better at one point for the Byzantine military to receive money, and through this money to hire larger number of mercenaries, right? And especially from the reign of Nicephorus II, this is very evident, and there is especially a massive increase in light cavalry at this point, consisting basically entirely of auxiliary horse archers. This is important because at that time in the 10th century, the empire was regaining steam, momentum, and also, the mercenaries are cheaper, they move fast, especially light cavalry is also very readily available. Like, these are troops that you can find basically all along, especially around the Black Sea coast. These are troops that live in fair misery in their homeland, so the Byzantines can easily pay them, and they're relatively cheap to upkeep. As horse archers, they are terrific because they come straight from the steppes, where they learn to do that since they're very, very young. So they're best for that. And so the Byzantine army maintains its core of troops, especially the professional army led by the emperor, and some part of regional armies alongside. But the Byzantine army is surrounded by these swarms of auxiliary light horse archers that can pave the road for any advance everywhere as scouts, skirmishers, explorers, and it can lay waste the countryside. It can carry out scorched earth politics strategy against the enemy. They're excellent to harass the enemy, to pursue them, etc. While the heavier bulk of the army is represented by the Byzantines. Of course, that's really the center of power, right? The horse archers alone cannot overwhelm the core of the army, because it's tougher, it's better, it's armored, so they can resist under even this hail of arrows that these guys can throw at an incredibly fast rate and massive volume. But horse archery without shock elements, like heavy cavalry, doesn't work, because it's still part of combined tactics, combined armed tactics. Sorry. So just to give you one measure of these troops from the steppes that were employed as mercenaries and foreign auxiliaries into Byzantine army at the period, let's read here. So this had begun very early, telling the truth, not just later on, but you see that later on it increases. So already in the 6th century we have 16 50,000 hours allegedly, which is impossible, telling you the truth, because no army could ever even dream to surpass 50,000 men. Like, if you read more than 50,000 men, like in one single army, just know that it's wrong. Like, it never happens. So this kind of exaggeration is perfectly normal in this time sources. When you read such high numbers, you have to think they might have been easily 10,000, maybe even 20,000, but not more than that. Because 30,000 is already, for those times, technology and logistics, an amazing feat. Like 50,000 is a pure miracle, right? So 60,000 is impossible. But here we have allegedly 60,000 hours against the Slavs in 574. In 627, we have, so this is at the peak of the fight against Sassanid Persia under Heraclius. We have 40,000 Khazars against the Sassanids employed by the Byzantines. That also tells you how, the Khazars were, because the Khazars inhabited basically the, what would be Kazakhstan in fact today. So just in the north of the Sassanid Empire, and that was like, it's as if the Persians had paid the Huns to attack the Romans in the Balkans, right? It's the same equation, more or less, geographically. And that explains why the Khazars were so fond of the Byzantines, after all. And we have 30,000 Kurami Persians employed by the Byzantines at Battle at Morium in 838 against the Arabs. 40,000 Saracens at Crotone in 982. So these are excessive numbers, but it tells you how many troops could be hired, even from different, like, here we're talking about pagans or even Muslims, right? So the Byzantines, like any other people in the past, didn't give a freaking damn what religion you were, as long as you fought with them, which is basically the absolute regular standard of every single part of military history ever happened. And we have 15,000 Pechenegs against the Seljuks in 1049. Right here, the Pechenegs start appearing, and we'll talk a bit more in detail about these troops because they're very, very important. Basically, by the 11th century, virtually all of this, like, Byzantine auxiliary contingents are composed by Pechenegs, or just peoples of the steppes. And we have 40,000 Cumans against the same Pechenegs, however, at the Battle of Livonium in 1091. Right, just to tell you how this peoples do not serve the Byzantines for charity, but they do it obviously for their own interest as well. And there are actually other mentions of, for example, there is the army that in 821 was led by the rebel Thomas the Slav. That was using actually elements of the Byzantine army. This force was allegedly 80,000 strong, right? And it's impossible, of course, but it still tells you it was a big army, right? And this allegedly included Saracens, Persians, Georgians, Armenians, Alans, Circassians, Colchians, Slavs, Crimean Goths, and Huns. That is basically either, here it's meant like the Avars or the Onagers, right? And this is not an exaggeration. Like, Byzantine armies at this point were literally composed by all of these peoples, right? It was that ethnically mixed. And because these were simply, like, just imagine, there is nothing like the empire at this point. They're all pouring there to be hired. These are all kind of poor populations, right? Or at least poorer than what the empire is at this point. Maybe just the Saracens and the Persians are kind of comparable, but all the others, they're basically tribal / quasi-feudal peoples that or steppes peoples that have essentially a warlike culture, and they fight for loot and stuff like that, right? So they simply joined the army at this point, and many of them were actually framed within regular units, evidently, but They're overwhelmingly, this overwhelming number, and the fact that this army is recorded as composed by these elements, that tells you how many these were, right? By the end of the period, there is especially a reliance on other groups, chiefly, and also the Seljuks. So just in case you thought the Seljuks, the enemies of the Byzantines regularly employed Seljuks, right? So it doesn't matter that, yeah, they crushed the Byzantines and massacred whatever, this could be found literally everywhere. The Uzes as well, the Pechenegs, the Saracens, the Varangians, the Russians, the Franks, that were normally either Siculo-Normans or Germans or Frenchmen. Like, I think it's ridiculous when people think that the Crusades, were started where the Westerners had never been in the Near East. Like, if you look at the Byzantine army, even in the campaign and massacres, it was literally full of Westerners. Like, they were all over. It was full of Western mercenaries basically everywhere, fighting for every single power out there. Byzantines, Muslims, they were all over. And this tells you how dynamic this world was, because if all of these peoples are around, it's because there is a freaking lot of money there. That these powers, either the Byzantines or the Muslims, have plenty of precious metal to pay these guys. There is a thematic master of the Byzantine Empire in 1067 that is recorded to have included Slavs, Bulgars, and probably Armenians and Uzes and Franks and Varangians, and, quote, literally, other mercenaries who happen to be about. Which means you take out the money, and these guys are gonna run like fly on honey, right? It's full of them. These are all people, like, at this point, the 11th century is also demographic revival, growth. There is it's plenty of young men out there that just want to make a living in the army, or looting, or whatever, and they come from literally everywhere. Right, from literally everywhere. Anna Komnena talks about the mercenaries employed by her father Alexius I, and as horsemen and footmen coming out of all lands. Right, and this was, naturally, it's partly propagandistic, because it has to stress the fact that the empire was universal, that all the peoples were basically influenced by the empire, but it was obvious, like, these people literally came from everywhere, even from thousands of kilometers away, just to fight in there. Right? It's amazing. And this time the empire is expanding once again. It fights a lot of wars. It has the money, the resources to do it. So people are gonna pour in their ranks to receive the pay, right? And usually these troops were brigaded by nationality, right? Even their commanders and officers were sometimes often same connationals, right? And these weren't just even random wanderers. It was plenty of other polities that depended on the empire in some way, other satellite states or vassals that would send regularly some troops on their own from anywhere, like even from Muslim principalities. There are also a lot of slaves or prisoners of war, principally Slavs and Turks, that are employed by the Byzantines, and were resettled on the frontiers, usually in the opposite direction from which their homeland was, so they didn't have any thinking of escaping from the other side, which is a pretty sensible option. So the empire is used to do such things on a regular basis, like resettling great groups of people. Like it happened with the Armenians as well, when they go into Cilicia, for example. This corresponds all to this political and strategic plans. and sometimes as simple as repopulating one area that you want to defend, or you want to make economically prosper in some way. And some of these peoples, by the way, are settled from completely different backgrounds. The example of the Pechenegs is very important because those are settled, for example, since 1048 into Roman territory. Those were nomads, right? Just like the Uzes in 1065. Obviously they weren't, as we've seen, particularly appreciated because of their loyalty, but they however made their job. In fact, the Pechenegs, especially we were saying before, were particularly important as let's say for example, the band of Manzikert, they would stay loyal to Romanus up to the very end. Like their existence, said, like this myth that mercenaries are unreliable, it's probably one of those stupid romantic nationalistic myths of the 19th century, where the nation state had to propagandate the fact that the mercenary was just a bloody, thirsty son of whatever, because it fights for money. Well, why? Because citizens fight for what exactly? That has nothing to do. If a mercenary comes under your service, of course he does it for money, but he's probably going to serve who was not going to fail, right? Also because pay arrives later. So actually, having mercenaries is not just convenient, but it also shows, propagandistically speaking, that you are rich. Like a state that has an enormous amount of mercenaries, attracts other mercenaries, attracts power, attracts people who become part of your clientele that you can settle, as we've seen now. Consider that between the 9th and the 10th century, the Byzantine army couldn't raise more than 4,000 regular cavalry on its own. So when you look at the numbers of the mercenaries, you remain impressed. Like in 1049, the empire employed 50,000 Pechenegs, right? In actually in part before, but chiefly in post-Manzikert era, the Byzantines had 3,000 Normans in its own service. So this is all pre-Crusade, right? In 1078, for example, there were 2,000 Seljuk Turks in Byzantine. In the Byzantine army as a whole, actually. So this is just some years after Manzikert. You have 2,000 Turks that fight for the Byzantines, Seljuk Turks. And plus there were 6,000 Alans, but there were people. This is an anachronism. Like, these are populations of the steppes of disputed origin. 8,000 Normans, and an unknown number of Pechenegs and Italians. So this is really a lot of people, right? A lot of people who, in this moment of alleged crisis, are en masse within the Byzantine army, which proves that the Byzantine army was florid, could pay these people, could attract them, and these peoples weren't coming literally at this point anymore from strictly poor places, like the Siculo-Normans or the Italians, whatever you're called here. Like, they were, substantially rich, sanitarized places as well. So this speaks really for the wealth of the empire at this point. And we know that in 1091 there might have been, as we've seen before, up to 40,000 Cumans fighting alongside the Byzantines at the Battle of Livunium against the Pechenegs. Right? It's really a lot. So, in general, we have to think that all of this is subject to political differentiation. Like, it's obvious that certain mercenaries couldn't be completely trusted, reliable because they had different interests, they found other employers or whatever, but in general the presence of these troops, as we were saying, is actually a very positive indicator, contrary-wise to every prejudice and whatever. So I hope that this video expands broadly in its superficiality, in letting you think how structural and habitual it was for the Roman Empire to use auxiliaries actually throughout the whole existence, its whole existence. Like, it's very laughable when you say you hear people like saying, the Roman Empire declined because it started hiring mercenaries, and like foreigners. Like, there was never, like from Republican times onwards, but even from before, there's never been a single moment, I mean literally a single moment in Roman history in which the number of foreigners was inferior to the one of citizens in the Roman army. Like, Rome conquered the world chiefly with foreigners, not with legionnaires. Right? You can say legionnaires, of course, were the core troops, they were the heavy, the big guns, but numerically speaking, at literally all single times of Roman military history, the numerical majority of troops was foreign. And that's partly the reason why the Roman Empire made it, because if it hadn't done that way, he would have never been able to have the manpower actually to control the empire, to keep it expanding, and to have fresh forces of people that were serving Rome in exchange for something. It was either the land of money, and that contributed decisively, like, determined, however, that its expansion and its success, historically speaking. And the Byzantine Empire does, like, which is the same Roman Empire, but say in its revival in the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, so it does exactly the same. And alongside, you can see that a healthy Roman army is the one that, alongside the core of its statal troops, has this overwhelming number of mercenaries, because at that point that the state functions well, because they have the money to have those troops that are gonna. By the way, if you hire, by the way, you keep within your own standards, like your own units. They're not going to fight for someone else at that point. It's also very important. Like, they're not a few people. I'm talking about thousands of Normans in the 11th century. Means to say that these guys, if they're not under Byzantine standards, that they're somewhere else, and probably against the Byzantines. So 3,000 people in the 11th century is a freaking lot of people, considering the density of the population. And yeah, so it's pretty meaningful. And we could expand it to the Low Middle Ages, where you actually see that the Byzantines increasingly settle number of Frankish mercenaries, chiefly from Italy, but also from other European countries. They make them turn to feudatories on their own, right? Which is typical also of late Byzantine times. But whatever, for now, I'll stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.